Greetings, students. Aaron, Tyler, Angel, Shiraz, and Brissietta, if you're around, feel free to come back to us. I hope you had some sort of a break the last couple of weeks. I know things are kind of strange and surreal, but I hope that there was some sort of reprieve for you. And now we get back to school, and hopefully it's some distraction. I'm finding it very helpful to get back into this stuff and start watching the news and things like that. We're going to talk about traditional forms of poetry today. And there are two types of forms. Forms determined by content and forms determined by rhyme scheme. And we had a class on rhyme a couple of weeks ago, and I showed you how to do a rhyme scheme of a poem. So that's going to come back into play today. It was fairly simple, so I think most of you will remember it. Let me go through the forms determined by content, most of which we have had examples of in previous classes. So there is a narrative poem, which is basically just a condensed story, a poem that tells some sort of story, like the epics, Iliad and the Odyssey, examples of narrative poems. Didactic poems, there aren't many of them, but they're written to make a point or argue a position. Didactic just simply means to speech. So being able to take a position on an issue and make a poetry of it. The third one is elegies, which we've had 2 or 3 examples of. First one that comes to mind is the Ben Jonson poem on his son. Those are songs of mourning. Sometimes they're used to address political situations as well. We have epigrams and aphorisms, which are quite similar. They're very short poems. An epigram, the French love these, by the way. Epigrams are short, humorous poems to make a witty observation. So often just very terse, quick poems that make some sort of witty comment. Aphorisms are short statements on principle or sentiment, so they're poems that give off some sort of wisdom. They're wisdom sayings, if you like, and often aphorisms are written by religious teachers and people like that. Ballads we've run into. Ballads are stories recited slowly in taverns, and they would build up in 4-line stanzas. We had a modern ballad of Birmingham, I think, but there are a number of examples in the book. So it's good to know these types of poems so that you can identify is it next week when you pick your own poem, what kind of poem it is. There is something called a dramatic monologue. It's almost like a speech lifted out of a play in verse format and plonked as a single poem upon a page. Those were popular in the Romantic period. If you want an example of one, 1132 is the famous Robert Browning poem, My Last Duchess. And he takes a person on a persona. He doesn't write from his own perspective. He's taking on a character there. So it's almost like a dress in a play. So that's a dramatic monologue. Lyric poems simply express personal emotions and feelings, kind of like song lyrics, if you like. Often written in the first person, almost always written in the first person. And the one that comes to mind is the How Do I Love Thee poem that we looked at a number of weeks ago. So lyric poems just are poems of very strong emotional feelings and emotions. The one I wanted to look at, or the one that I assigned this week, is the ode. And an ode is a poem of praise addressed to persons or as an apostrophe. Remember what an apostrophe means? It's an address, an abstract address out to the universe or something inanimate. And there are a number of these. They were developed by a Greek poet named Pindar, and they became very, very popular in the Romantic period. And the 2 that I assigned today are probably the 2 most famous English odes of the period. Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, and John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. So if you turn to page 940, and hopefully you read these before you started the video. Notice that in Shelley's ode, which is a number of verses and is quite long, and these are very difficult, so if you found them challenging, you're not alone. Notice that we have groups of 4 lines here. Sorry, groups of 3 lines here, 3, 6, 9, 12, and then a couplet at the end, which makes 14. That'll come into play later on in this video. And it's an ode to the west wind. So the praise is given directly to the west wind, and it starts out as a sort of addressing an inanimate object, but then it becomes more emotional as the poem progresses, and it's obviously that he's talking about some sort of internal pain or wrangling, and that the west wind then becomes metaphoric as you go through the poem. And then there's a direct request: make me thy lyre even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own, the tumult of the mighty harmonies. So he becomes one with the west wind and goes through that autumnal process that's highlighted earlier in the poem. When you get to Keats, it's very, very different. 1146 is the page, and this one is probably even more famous. It's one of the most famous poems by an English poet outside of Shakespeare. And notice that this is ode on the Grecian urn. So the ode itself is actually like a cartoon depiction on an urn. If you remember your Hercules Disney film, the beginning, the cartoon on the amphora at the beginning of the movie, which is basically an urn. Okay, yes, it is on 1146, and you have a picture there of a Greek vase illustrating what I just talked about. And so the urn itself, or sorry, the ode itself is on the urn. That's the praise. This is a scene that he's looking at. It seems to be a pagan scene back in antiquitous times, Greek and Roman times. And he describes all the things that are going on in the urn, on the depiction on the urn, and how it makes him feel. Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. So this is a fixed state in this particular depiction or painting that he yearns for. So there's a heavy yearning in the poem. And with both of these poets, they are trying to, in all their poetry, escape the clutches of a domineering and officious religion that was still had a grip on society at that time. So they're yearning for earlier, more pagan, pre-Christian times. Both of these poems are trying to get back to what they consider a more natural religious state, which was the one in practice by the Greeks and Romans before the Christian period came along. And you can see it, Keats in this particular poem is yearning to be a part of that, and he ends with the great line, truth is beauty, beauty is truth, truth beauty, and that's all you need know on earth and all you need to know. So he dispenses with a lot of the trappings of religious thought and gets back to what he considers to be a more direct spiritual pagan sort of natural earth motif. So that's the ode, which can be written in any format. Now we get to the types of poetry that are governed by rhyme scheme, and I have to go over some terms with you. So when you get a unit of 2 lines, like an AA line, it's a couplet. When you get a unit of 3, it's a tercet. When you get a unit of 4 lines, it could be AABB or ABAB or ABBA. It's a quatrain. A unit of 6 lines is a sestet, and a unit of 8 lines is an octave. And there are examples of tercets and quatrains on page 952 to 954 in your book if you want to see some examples of what I'm talking about. The other thing to know is that a stanza, which is an Italian word loosely for verse, is a unit of verse separated by space, often with repeated rhyme or meter. So often we break poems up into stanzas, units, or verses. And there are literally hundreds and thousands of poems determined by rhyme scheme. I'm just going to give you a few examples. And as I'm getting to the 12-minute mark here, it might have to go to another video. So just be forewarned. By the way, please do indicate your presence in the comments to this video so that I know that you watched it. On the next video, I'll probably have you do something different to do that. So be sure to watch and follow directives. So if we turn to page 967, we come to a group of poems that are what we call sonnets. And these are probably the most famous of all the rhyme form poems. And I'll try to briefly illustrate how they work. So if you look at the poem by Shakespeare on 967, My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, and you work out a rhyme scheme. So have it open in front of you. You can see sun, red, dun, head, A, B, A, B. White cheeks, delight, reeks, CD, CD. No sound, go, ground, E, F, E, F. And then at the end you have two lines that match, rare and compare, which become G, G. So the rhyme scheme of the poem is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So what we have with A, B, A, B is one quatrain. Then we have C, D, C, D, which is a second quatrain. E, F, E, F, which is a third quatrain. And then G, G, which is a couplet. It amounts to 14 lines, and sonnets are always 14 lines. So this is what we call an English or a Shakespearean or Elizabethan. We'll just use English for simplicity. This is an English sonnet. English sonnets always have 3 quatrains and a couplet. And the quick way of identifying them, not always, but one quick way of getting to it is to go to the bottom of the poem and see if you see a couplet. If you see a couplet, chances are it's probably an English sonnet. But there are different. There's another major type of sonnet as well, something called an Italian or a Petrarchan sonnet, because it was developed by an Italian poet named Petrarch. So if you turn to page, the next page actually, which is the William Wordsworth sonnet, Nuns Fret Not, you can see it's another 14-line poem, so we can assume it's probably a sonnet. And if you look at the rhyme scheme there, I get A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C, C, D. If you need to pause and map that out for yourself so you know what I'm talking about, then please do so. But at the end of the line, you have room, cells, citadels, loom, bloom, bells, bells, doom. That's all one unit. And that's 8, so that's an octave, right? And then you have a different grouping of rhymes. Me, bound, ground, B, liberty, found, which is C, D, D, C, C, D. That is a sestet. So instead of having 3 quatrains in a couplet, like with an English sonnet, what you have here is a sestet, an octave plus a sestet. And that is an Italian sonnet. So you need to be able to tell the difference between those two, because it's going to come up on the final exam. But what I would like you to do, and then I'll start another video, is go through this chapter here, look at the Milton When I Consider How My Light Is Spent, look at the Christina Rossetti In an Artist's Studio, which is on page 970. Look at the 2 first sonnets by Edna St. Vincent Millay, What Lips My Lips Have Kissed, and Women Who Have Loved Before As I Love Now. So there are 4 sonnets. See if you can identify which are English and which are Italian, and put them in the comments to this video. So not only do you have to identify yourself with a comment, answer that question, and I will have to take this to a second video, so watch that one after this and I'll see you there.